This move, 1, e4, immediately stakes a claim in the center, opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, and prepares for rapid development of minor pieces, setting the stage for many popular and aggressive opening systems. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, Black's most ambitious and complex response to 1, e4, immediately creating an asymmetrical pawn structure and fighting for central control by challenging White's d4 square. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and combative opening where White aims for central control and rapid development, while Black seeks counterplay and imbalances. This move, 2, d6, initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, a solid and popular choice that prepares to support the c5 pawn and allows for the development of the dark squared bishop. This move, 3, d4, strikes at the center, aiming to open lines and challenge Black's pawn structure in the Sicilian defense, leading to complex and often sharp play. This capture initiates the open Sicilian, a complex and sharp battleground where Black accepts the pawn structure challenge, aiming for dynamic counterplay in exchange for potentially giving White a central pawn majority. This move initiates the main line of the open Sicilian, aiming to gain central space and tempo by recapturing the pawn with a developed knight. This move, developing the knight to a central square, prepares to castle kingside and challenges White's central pawn majority, typical of many Sicilian defense lines. This move develops a piece to its natural square, contests the center with the knight, and prepares for further pawn advances, reflecting standard Sicilian defense theory. This move, the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, prepares to prevent White's intended pawn push to b4, while maintaining flexibility for Black's pieces and potentially opening the a-file later. Developing the bishop to g5 pins the knight on f6, preparing to exert pressure on Black's kingside and potentially disrupt their pawn structure should they play e6. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop by creating a pathway and also frees the queen, while also anticipating White's potential bishop development to e3 or bc4. This move initiates the same-ish variation of the King's Indian attack setup within the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center with pawns and prepare for a kingside attack by developing the f-pawn to support the e4 pawn and potentially open lines for future operations. This move prepares to castle kingside and develops a piece, addressing the immediate threats and aiming to complete piece development in this sharp Sicilian Najdorf variation. This move develops the queen to a more active central square, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for potential kingside attacks or tactical sequences involving the f4 pawn. Developing the queen to c7 is a standard move in this Sicilian Najdorf variation, preparing to castle queenside and connect the rooks while reinforcing the d6 pawn and potentially supporting a later b5 advance. Castling queenside prepares for a dynamic pawn storm on the kingside and brings the rook to a more active central file, setting up an aggressive battle. This move continues the development of Black's pieces in the typical closed Sicilian structure, preparing to reinforce the center and potentially challenge White's kingside attack. This aggressive pawn push on g4 aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially open lines against Black's castled king, but it also weakens White's own king position and requires careful follow-up to avoid counterplay. This move initiates a thematic pawn advance in many Sicilian variations, aiming to gain space on the queenside and potentially challenge White's central control or create weaknesses in their pawn structure. This move resolves white's queenside castling tension by eliminating black's knight and opening the g-file for potential kingside attack while preparing to recapture with the queen. This pawn break opens the g-file for your rook and creates an isolated d-pawn for black, potentially leading to kingside attacking chances or a queenside initiative for white. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, preventing black's b4 pawn break and potentially creating a passed pawn on the a-file. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing to contest the long diagonal. This pawn push aggressively challenges black's kingside, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and exploit the weakened pawn structure resulting from gxf6. This move creates a central pawn tension and opens up the e-file for potential future action by black's queen and rooks, while also preparing to challenge white's aggressively advanced f-pawn. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn storm or to defend key central squares, while also freeing the f1 square for the king or another piece. This move is a logical response to white's aggressive kingside pawn push and knight maneuver, aiming to free the pinned knight on d7 and prepare for a counterplay initiative on the queenside. This move initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to exchange the knight for black's bishop on b7, thereby weakening black's kingside pawn structure and controlling key central squares. This exchange simplifies the position, removing white's strong knight and opening the g-file for black's rook to potentially exploit later in the game. The capture opens the e-file and aims to control the center, but it also weakens the d5 pawn, creating a potential target for black's queenside pressure. This move activates the rook on the semi-open c-file, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create counterplay against white's king. This move aims to develop the knight to its most active square, controlling key central squares and preparing to challenge black's pawn structure, particularly the d6 pawn. This move introduces a tactical skirmish by activating the knight, targeting white's weak pawns and potentially disrupting white's coordinated pieces. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, aiming to simplify the position and reduce black's active piece coordination, particularly by removing the knight that was eyeing the c4 square. This move opens a crucial file for black's rook and aims to create an imbalance in the pawn structure, potentially leading to active piece play on the queenside. This prophylactic move shores up the king's safety on the queenside and prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square. This move activates the rook to a more aggressive file, preparing to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside. This king move is primarily defensive, repositioning the monarch away from the open c-file and the potential threats emanating from black's active pieces on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to open lines for your pieces and create attacking chances against white's potentially vulnerable king, while also challenging white's king's safety. The bishop retreats to safety, preparing to reposition to the kingside where it can potentially support an attack or defend the king. This move prepares to activate the rook on the g-file, aiming to create attacking chances against black's castled king and exploit the open lines that have resulted from pawn exchanges. The move k7 is an active choice to centralize the king and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside, as white's pawn structure has been significantly weakened by the previous exchanges. This move repositions the queen from the open file to a more secure square while maintaining attacking potential and preparing to support the g-pawn's advance or a kingside offensive. This move aims to activate the bishop along the long diagonal, eyeing white's kingside and potentially preparing for further pawn advances on the queenside or central play to challenge white's pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support the central pawn push and potentially coordinate with the other rook for an attack on black's king. This move aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside or to challenge white's kingside pawn advances. The move qf2 repositions the queen to a more flexible square, supporting the king's side while potentially preparing a future kingside pawn advance or queenside maneuvering. The rook repositions to the 7th rank, aiming to pressure white's weakened kingside pawns and potentially activate along the open b-file. White's move 26. RB1 supports the pawn on b2 and prepares to contest the open b-file, potentially aiming for queenside counterplay against black's somewhat exposed king. This move aims to double rooks on the b-file, creating significant pressure against white's queenside pawns and potentially opening lines for attack. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the critical d5 square and potentially threaten the pawn on c4 or a knight on b6. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and supports the knight's advance, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside. This tactical exchange simplifies the position, removing black's strong knight and opening the g-file for white's rook, while simultaneously challenging black's awkwardly placed king. This move repositions the queen to the queenside, aiming to create counterplay along the b-file and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. After white's pawn advances, this move sacrifices the knight to force the black king into a more exposed position and create attacking chances on the weakened kingside. The king's desperate flight into the center, while temporarily escaping the immediate knight check, exposes it to further threats and sacrifices along the open h-file, signaling a critical defensive struggle. This move, c3, is a defensive maneuver aimed at solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to reinforce the beleaguered king's position, potentially by moving the king to safety or by creating counterplay against black's advanced pieces. The move, bc1, while seemingly opportunistic, overlooks the critical threat of white's pawn push and neglects proper defensive consolidation. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and prepares to defend the vulnerable kingside pawn structure. This move is a powerful tactical shot, exploiting the pin on white's g2 rook and opening up the critical b-file for black's queen and rook, to exert pressure on white's vulnerable king. This move is forced and leads to a material draw by repetition after white recaptures, as black has no effective continuations to avoid this outcome. This exchange captures the bishop for the rook on the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt white's queenside control and potentially create tactical chances along the open b-file. This move repositions the queen to safety and prepares to contest the critical c-file after the exchange of queenside material. This move is a crucial defensive maneuver, repositioning the queen to safeguard the king on the queenside while simultaneously threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure by attacking the c3 pawn. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the f-file, potentially disrupting black's queenside pawn structure and creating dynamic play. This move aims to exploit the open a-file and pressure white's kingside, potentially leading to tactical opportunities against the exposed king. White captures the rook on b2, resolving the immediate threat and regaining material equality, aiming to leverage the exposed black king in the endgame. This move is a decisive recapture that forces the exchange of queens and simplifies into a winning endgame for black, leveraging the advantage of the extra pawn. The recapture of the rook on b2 is a forcing sequence that simplifies the position and leads to a winning endgame for white due to the passed pawn on the queenside and black's king being exposed. Black recaptures the pawn, aiming to simplify the position into a more manageable endgame where their extra rook can prove decisive against white's disconnected pawns. The rook activates to the 7th rank, aiming to exploit the weakened king's position and potentially create mating threats or win material. This checks the king and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and king safety, potentially creating counterplay on the queenside. The king retreats to safety, stepping away from the deadly discoverable check from the black queen and preparing to potentially anchor its defense on the queenside. This move continues white's strong initiative on the kingside and exploits the open lines created by white's pawn storm. White retreats the king to a safer square on the back rank, avoiding further checks and preparing to consolidate the material advantage after black's gambit. This move is a check that forces the white king to a potentially exposed square on b2, aiming to continue the perpetual check sequence or find an opportunity to capture material with the queen. White is forced to retreat the king to avoid perpetual check, accepting a compromised pawn structure and a passive king position. This move is a decisive check, forcing the white king to a vulnerable square and allowing black to recapture the queen with an overwhelming material advantage.